When I started researching this video, I noticed that a lot of the criticism targeting self-made documentaries came down to the fact that it only showed one side of the story and that wasn't fair.
When this documentary came out, it just really bothered me.
It's the story of Beyoncé, of Pamela, of Taylor Swift, from their perspective.
I blocked that stolen tape out of my life in order to survive.
Just gonna go have fun. No one out there that I know of in the audience actively hates me.
Like when you are looking through the eyes of your children.
Know that all of my struggle and sacrifice.
A nice girl smiles and waves and says thank you.
Why can't we be the heroes of our own life story?
Fix this, because this is a very big problem.
When I typed Renaissance on Google, I saw that the movie was titled Renaissance, a film by Beyoncé. So they very openly promote the fact that it is written, directed, and produced, even I think, by Beyoncé. As a listener and fan of Beyoncé, I have to admit that I kind of like that. I kind of like the fact that this is Beyoncé directly talking to me, the fan. It sort of fed my parasocial relationship with this artist, and it also fulfilled that desire to, as they say in pretty much all the celebrity documentaries, hear their story with their own words. Celeb documentaries, just as much as TV reality or true crime even, fulfill our primal impulses, our love for drama. But we don't need them to fulfill those needs, right? I mean, in our daily lives, there are times where, we end up in conflictual situations and we have to hear different stories, we have to hear different versions of the same story. Like if two friends of mine decided to break up tomorrow, I would like to know each version of the story, to make my own opinion using my own biases. Because of that, I feel like when people argue that it's not fair because they get to tell their story without any nuance, it's kind of hypocritical because we all kind of do it, right? I recently broke up with my boyfriend and obviously I had to tell the story of what happened to various people. And I'm sure that if my ex-boyfriend was in the room when I was telling that story, he would probably disagree with some aspects of it. He'd probably intervene and give his own version of the story, how this or that event made him feel. So the problem for me isn't so much that those celebrities get to tell their version of the story, because it's not meant to be scientific, journalistic. It's like TV reality, I'm not expecting this to be fact-checked. I mean, don't get me wrong, if the documentary is full of lies and false allegations, then yeah, that is pretty bad. But for me, it's not so much the documentary that is the problem, it's more the person and that character. So it's still them in that documentary because they've proved that they are a blatant liar. People will come up with fact-checking and stuff like that on Twitter and everything, so they know very much what they're doing. So the problem for me is the power imbalances between different stories. So a few months ago, Squeezie, the most popular YouTuber in France, tweeted that the documentary telling everything he has gone through was going to be released in January and had been filmed by his best friend. As soon as this was published on Twitter/X, user Anaid retweeted and commented the following, quote, "Personally, I'm a writer and I co-wrote Squeezie's album in 2020. I'd also like to tell you everything I went through, but I've already been legally threatened by his team, even though I have never shared anything publicly. What a luxury to have a voice. What a luxury to have a voice." This is probably something that Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie could have said in her popular TED Talk titled "The Dangers of a Single Story." So in that video, which is very well made, very educational, the writer recalls her first experiences with literature. And at that time, literature meant primarily European and North American literature. At some point she said, "I didn't know that people like me could exist in literature." And later added that African writers saved me from having a single story of what books are. Later in the video, she also mentions Fide, who worked at her house as a domestic worker and whom her mom said was very poor. Actually, I'll let her talk because she tells the story way better than I could.
Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit, and his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them.
So this story is obviously a metaphor for the stereotyping she experienced as a Black Nigerian woman in the US. She shows that she has also been guilty of doing that stereotyping in the past because of ignorance. And so as her talk comes to an end, Ngozi Adichie concludes by referencing writer Chinua Achebe's idea of a balance of stories in response to the single story. The idea of a balance of stories means the introduction of stories that haven't been told yet, but also a readjustment of the power of each story. That second element, the readjustment of power, becomes super important when we think about something like the post-Me Too era, or just Me Too in general. Sure, people of all spheres of society have called out sexual violence, but still, their stories are very likely to be silenced, dismissed, or immediately tagged as lies. So going back to the topic of the video, celebrity documentaries, I feel like now is the good time to assess the pros and cons of that medium, the documentary. In terms of pros, we can say that the documentary puts the celebrity in a state of vulnerability. It's them and the viewer, their story, without, it seems, the managers, the sponsors, family members to some degree, friends, etc., etc. And the second thing is that the documentary is quite long, so it means that the celebrity has a lot of time to go in depth and generate empathy. Now, the cons of this medium is that it costs a lot of money to produce and distribute. That's why someone like Anaïd commented, "What a luxury to have a voice." Yeah, she's right. Not everybody has the luxury to produce a hour or hour and a half long documentary about themselves. Now, when I see that, I'm then wondering, who can produce documentaries? Well, sometimes the celebrity will pay for it, but most of the time an established studio will invest in it, will produce the documentary. So it is establishment money, really, that push certain stories forward and kind of neglect others. As an example, and this is not a documentary, but it's kind of is. I mean, you'll see what I mean. J'accuse by Polanski received a lot of money from public institutions, 25 million euros. That's a lot of money. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, Polanski was accused and pleaded guilty for the rape of a teenage girl that he forced to take drugs. Because of that, he fled the US and continued to make movies in Europe, including J'accuse, which tell the story of a Jewish officer, Dreyfus, falsely accused of treason because of his Jewish identity, because of anti-Semitism. Now, Polanski said that he wanted to tell the story of Dreyfus, because he felt that there was a connection with his story, the story of a persecuted Jewish man falsely accused by a mob of vicious people. That was very bold, you know, comparing the story of Dreyfus to his story, to accusations of sexual violence. That is very bold, but the French cinema community loves it. They love the stories. They love to be problematic. It's very exciting for them, I guess. And so they gave Polanski the Best Director award at the César ceremony. So in response to what happened, Adèle Haenel, one of the main characters of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, who was present during the ceremony, left the room, and feminist writer Virginie Despentes wrote an open letter to French cinema titled "From Now On, we stand up and leave," in which she brilliantly addressed the complicity of French cinema with abusers and predators like Polanski.
Polanski pour J'accuse.
I wanted to tell that story because it is very revealing of that imbalance of power that we've been talking about, you know. On the one hand, you have Polanski, who has been accused of many different things and still has the support of the French cinema community, of public institutions that will produce his movies. He still gets awards and everything. And on the other hand, you have sort of the representation of that sexual violence through Adèle Haenel, who has also been a victim of director's abuse. And that woman, she has to leave the room. But when she leaves the room, she also leaves her career in that room. So documentaries, biopics, and hidden biopics like J'accuse are produced by the most powerful. And in our society, the most powerful are usually the ones who have the most money. Now, it is true that more and more people from marginalized communities are reaching a level of wealth that allow them to produce themselves their documentaries, so to finally have a voice. I'm thinking about Beyoncé, Taylor Swift to some degree, I'll explain why later, or people like Pamela Anderson. I actually watched Pamela, A Love Story. I really liked the documentary. She is the primary narrator of the story, and it really feels like we're sitting with her on the sofa and having this conversation with her. She shared the physical, sexual, and psychological abuse she experienced throughout her life. She talked about her working-class childhood with an alcoholic father, but also the sex tape that was stolen and released without her and her husband's consent. It felt refreshing to hear her story from her perspective, because I remember that throughout my childhood and teenage years, I would see her as a sort of caricature, you know? She was the woman with big boobies defending animal rights and looking kind of dumb on TV. I mentioned Taylor Swift right before, and it is true that in Miss Americana, Taylor Swift shares how she experienced the hate and comments on her body throughout the years, the sort of misogyny associated with that. So can we really talk about power imbalances in those cases? It's a bit more complex than that, right? Actually, we could argue that some of those documentaries help achieve the balance of stories that we mentioned earlier. Yes, of course, they are good publicity for the people that are starring in those documentaries, but at the same time, they serve as a medium to discuss bigger topics, bigger issues like sexism or what it's like to grow up working class. But still, that does not really resolve the issue that in order to get your voice heard, you need to have power. And in our society, that means money. So class remains a big issue. And in fact, some celebrities coming from marginalized communities may be able to shed light on certain issues, but they may also perpetuate other systemic issues because of their class status. That was the case for Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the writer I mentioned earlier. Well, now she's a famous writer, giving conferences in the most prestigious universities. So she has developed a social and economic capital that give her voice a certain legitimacy. She's now in a position where people want to hear what she thinks about a variety of topics, including topics that she doesn't really know anything about. By that I mean that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has been accused of sort of supporting J.K. Rowling's transphobia and also make problematic comments herself. Now, I looked at her arguments, her comments in various interviews, and yeah, it is revealing of a lack of understanding of what the trans experience is. So it is revealing of ignorance, the same ignorance she pointed out and asked us to be cautious about in her TED Talk. The same ignorance that she said could lead to some voices being silenced. So one question arises: how do we create the structures and media to allow people to share their story, specifically the people who are still silenced, specifically the voices that are still hard to hear? Well, let's go back to celebrity documentaries to try to find an answer. One thing that those documentaries do is that they trigger empathy, humanity. We love documentaries as a medium because they look very real, very raw compared to TV or social media even, where everything is filtered or exaggerated. The medium of the documentary builds commonality through shared traumas or shared experiences. That's why even though celebrities live lives that are completely different from ours, we still manage to relate to them through those shared traumas, for example. So how can we achieve the same thing with underprivileged people who oftentimes have life experiences that are much more relatable than that of celebrities? One potential answer to this issue is the concept of cultural democracy, but I will rather call it reconnecting with the real. So if you Google cultural democracy online, you will find this definition. Quote, an approach to arts and culture that actively engages everyone in deciding what counts as culture, where it happens, who makes it, and who experiences it. No matter your background, identity, gender, class, nationality, the goal of culture is to represent the variety of experiences that exist on Earth. And the ultimate goal is to do that as authentically and equally as possible. One example of that actually was the Community Program Unit, the CPU, a department of the BBC. I'm going to read you the new exhibition summary of what it was. Set up in 1972, the CPU provided a camera crew and studio and handed over complete editorial control to groups and individuals with, quote, voices, attitudes, and opinions hitherto unheard or seriously neglected, so they could make their own programs. Several hundred campaigning and community groups and individuals representing amongst myriad others anarchists, farm workers, black teachers, women priests, office cleaners, radical housing associations, trans women, ex-cons, situationists, film co-ops, neurodiverse people, freethinkers, and channelers of the extraterrestrial produced autonomous material that was broadcast on BBC Two between 1973 and 1983 in a series called Open Door. Now, this is cultural democracy because the people who direct and perform in those documentaries come from various backgrounds. And this wasn't necessarily a niche hipster thing because it was produced by the BBC and distributed by them as well. We can say that by producing this series, the BBC, quote, generalized the conditions of access to universality. Yeah, that sounds very fancy. This quote is from French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, and basically what it means is that the CPU documentaries help people reconnect to day-to-day social realities, to get out, touch grass, and empathize with people whose stories they might not be able to fully relate to, but stories that are still valuable and that they can learn from. This way of producing documentaries very much goes against what is currently done. What you currently have is a sort of group of elite people at the top, establishment media, deciding where the money is going to go, what is going to be produced based on how profitable that might be. But we still have a little bit of an issue here that needs to be resolved. When someone says, give a voice to those who've been silenced, for me that means marginalized communities. So women, ethnic minorities, trans people, queer people, people with disabilities, etc. But for others, giving a voice to those who have been silenced means something completely different. It means anti-vaxxers, it means white men, it means stay-at-home wives. In fact, when Bourdieu talked about reconnecting with the real, or as he put it, generalizing the conditions of access to universality, he warned that those who are in charge of receiving the real and then sharing it with people must contextualize. They must historicize or add extra educational value. In his essay on television, he argued that if journalists did their job correctly and weren't slave to corporate profits, they could avoid providing a platform for sensationalism, conspiracy theories, and instead organize themselves to promote cultural democracy. So to conclude, not all voices are equal, even though the concept of cultural democracy is progressively making its way in the media. Those who can produce and make documentaries are usually the wealthiest. Also, even though it sounds very authentic, very raw, statements like, this is my story or this is my experience, must always be contextualized, historicized, or questioned. Is it costly or convenient for this person to speak up? Is it just meant to save their face, or is it pushing for bigger ideas, bigger causes? I don't think we should be afraid to express that healthy degree of skepticism and to ask those questions, because it can actually further legitimize the story. You know, if the person has no interest in telling that story, if they are pushing for bigger causes, then yeah, that makes the story even more powerful. And finally, it is important to remember that the documentary is a great medium to generate empathy, humanity, because it reconnects to the real. It helps build commonality by showing the people behind the numbers. And it can truly be a source of mobilization if it is articulated around facts and science. So yeah, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, the conversation continues in the comments section. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, if it's not already done. I would like to thank my patrons for their support. A special thank to top tier patrons. A big thank you to James Siddle, Crux, Usual, Pablo, Patrick, Boris, Ria, Joey, Ivan, Remy, Trebizond, Toki, Corey G, Tristan, Patricia, Lenny, Ion, Donage, Alex, Ren, Manuel, and Perry. Before I leave, I need to talk to you about our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform to grow your presence online. They give you a bunch of tools to create your ideal websites. So this is mine so far, Alice Cappelleyt. I use it as a platform to kind of show all the work that I do on YouTube, my contributions, but also my book. I also added all my social media accounts. You also have analytical tools. You can run effective email campaigns. On their website, you can also get advice from professionals on how to build your website, etc. So many things you can do. So if you're interested in it, if you want to try it out, then go to squarespace.com to get a free trial. And once you're ready to go public, then you can go to squarespace.com/AliceCappelleyt to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you, Squarespace, for sponsoring the video. And yeah, that's it. Salut!